Friend, thank you for being here today. Did General Motors really believe it could just walk away without consequence? Did they truly think that shutting down an entire plant, putting more than 1,200 Canadian workers out of their jobs, pocketing billions in public support, and then retreating back to headquarters in Detroit as if nothing had happened was somehow acceptable? Or did the leadership at General Motors have a shocking late October morning when they suddenly realized they had made an irreversible mistake? Ladies and gentlemen, what unfolded next stunned Detroit more than any terror threat that had ever come before. Because on October 21st, 2025, General Motors announced a full tear-around of its operations. This was not a pause. It was a definitive end. The production line for the Bright Drop electric delivery vans at the CAMI plant in Ingersoll, Ontario was permanently shut down. More than 1,200 employees were laid off, not temporarily, but for good. The plant had already been closed since May, leaving thousands of families in the community of 14000 people struggling as the facility was the backbone of the local economy. And this is where the story becomes remarkable, because Ottawa did not respond with harsh words, nor did it send polite diplomatic notes. Canada reacted like a country that had been betrayed by its own partner. Just 3 days after the announcement from General Motors, the federal government forced the company's executives to scramble for legal advice. Ottawa slashed nearly 25% of the duty-free import quota for General Motors. Imagine what that means. Every United States-made General Motors vehicle destined for the Canadian market instantly faced a retaliatory tariff of 25%. Overnight, Stellantis was hit even harder. Its duty-free export privileges were cut by up to 50% after it shifted Jeep production to Illinois. This was not an impulsive retaliation. It was a deliberate, calculated, strategic move. Canada was sending a very clear message. You did not honor your commitments, and now you will face the consequences. If you are watching this program and believe that companies receiving Canadian taxpayer money should hold up their end of the bargain, give this a like, because what Melanie Jolie did is exactly what protecting workers truly looks like. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back, because none of this began in October. In 2022, General Motors made a promise. Ontario and Ottawa poured in billions, yes, billions, to modernize the Ingersoll plant for electric vehicle production. Bright Drop was marketed as a breakthrough, a long-term job creator for decades to come, a cornerstone of the industry's future. General Motors accepted every dollar of that support, but by April 2025, the company suddenly suspended production, citing weak demand and claiming operations would restart in May at a reduced scale. Workers trusted them. They stayed, hoping this was just a temporary setback. Maybe things will recover, they thought, but they never did. By May, the production line had come to a complete stop. More than 1,200 workers were let go. The union did everything it could to keep people's spirits up. Lana Payne, Unifor's national president, said exactly what workers were feeling, that they had stood by the company through every high and low that they were committed to and invested in this very plant. Then July passed, August passed, September passed, and still nothing. Detroit remained completely silent. Only uncertainty filled the air. Income was running out. Benefits became a looming question mark. Many families began asking whether this facility was even still meant to be an electric vehicle hub at all. Remember, this was Canada's first large-scale electric vehicle plant, a site expected to play a critical role in the clean energy strategy, to lead the market and help shape the future of North America's auto sector. And yet, General Motors took the support and walked away. So what happened next? Ottawa did not panic. They observed, analyzed, and prepared. And when General Motors announced its permanent closure on October 21st, Melanie Jolie was ready to act. And this is where things become especially interesting. Earlier this year, Canada established a new mechanism called the Auto Remission Framework. The name sounds technical, but in reality, it is an incredibly powerful tool. Under this framework, vehicles built in the United States and imported into Canada face a 25% tariff. However, if you are a manufacturer with active production in Canada, creating Canadian jobs and honoring your investment commitments, you are exempt from that tariff. This means you can still import vehicles from the United States without being penalized. It is a blend of incentive and discipline. The message is simple. Keep your promise, invest seriously, create jobs here, and Canada will stand with you. But if you break your commitments, your privileges disappear. General Motors chose not to keep its word. And on October 23rd, Finance Minister François Fay-Champagne and Industry Minister Melanie Jolie issued a joint statement that was firm but precise. They declared that both General Motors and Stellantis had acted contrary to their commitments to Canada and to Canadian workers. In other words, they had breached their agreements. As a result, Ottawa cut the duty-free import quota for General Motors by 24.2%. That means every General Motors vehicle built in the United States and shipped into the Canadian market must now pay a 25% tariff. Overnight profit margins shrank. Operating costs surged. Dealerships in Michigan began to panic. Chrysler, which had shifted Jeep production to Illinois, was hit even harder. Its duty-free privileges were slashed by half. But what earned the most respect was Melanie Joly's approach. She sent an official letter to Stellantis, short, cold, and unambiguous, reminding them that they had made legally binding commitments to maintain a presence in Canada. If they failed to comply, the federal government would claw back its funding. General Motors received a similar ultimatum. Joly convened a meeting with Unifor workers, the Ontario government, and General Motors executives. The message was brutally clear. You have 15 days to present a production plan for a new vehicle at this plant. Not a vague idea, not a generic promise, a concrete plan with timelines and accountability. These commitments were not empty words because Canada had already shown it was prepared to enforce them. If you saw what just happened, if you understand the precision with which Ottawa used economic tools as a form of sovereign power, then you know this is exactly how a confident nation defends its interests. And this is precisely where the mistake General Motors made began to snowball. Once Canada cut the tariff-free quota, the company suddenly realized it had no backup plan for the electric delivery vans that were supposed to be assembled in Ingersoll. United States dealerships were abruptly left without inventory, with their lots nearly empty. General Motors tried to contain the damage. They increased imports of vehicles from their United States plants, but now every one of those vehicles faced a 25% tariff. Suddenly, a model that cost $45,000 to build was landing in Canada at roughly $56,000 once it crossed the border. Dealers couldn't sell with that price gap. Customers walked away. Inventory piled up. Picture a General Motors dealer in Ohio right now. He has sales targets to meet customers waiting for vehicles and a supply chain whose costs are rising by the day. His European competitors face no extra tariffs beyond the standard rate. General Motors vehicles, meanwhile, are saddled with penalty duties simply because the company failed to keep its word to Canada. This isn't theory. It is happening right now in showrooms across Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. The stock price isn't reacting to an accident. It's reacting to fundamentally flawed decisions. And here lies the most painful irony. Donald Trump launched a trade war to bring manufacturing back to America. But instead of strengthening United States industry, he created an environment where American companies are tripping over one another. General Motors halted production in Canada. The result, American consumers pay more and wait longer. Supply chain managers in Detroit are now recalculating their entire playbook. With each day, the penalizing tariff remains in place. General Motors loses millions of dollars. Restarting the Ingrace plant suddenly becomes far cheaper than absorbing a permanent 25% tariff. That is the financial leverage now unfolding in real time. But this was not an impulsive retaliation. It was a deliberate move that would change the game overnight. Now look at the story through a human lens. The part so often forgotten in economic calculations. General Motors didn't just shut down a factory. They opened a wound Canadians had seen too many times before. On October 21st, 2025, General Motors quietly announced something that shook an entire community to its core: the permanent closure of the Bright Drop plant in Ingersoll, Ontario. No slow fade out, no transition plant, no new model pipeline, just a blunt final message. It is over. For more than 1,000 families, this wasn't some corporate restructuring. This was a catastrophe. Over 1,200 workers suddenly lost the stability they had trusted for years. People who had spent a decade or more on the production line woke up to mortgages without income, health care without certainty, pensions without guarantees. Imagine you are a single mother in Ingersoll who has worked 12 years at the Cami plant. You have 2 kids, a mortgage and health insurance tied to that job. You are loyal to General Motors. You know every step on the line, and you have built your life around the stability of that income. Then May 2025 arrives. You are laid off temporarily. The company says it is just a short interruption. You wait, you hope, you apply for employment insurance, you tighten your budget and try to hold your life together. Then October comes, the news of a permanent shutdown. No new model, no return date. It is over. You call the Human Resources Department at General Motors, you ask about your pension, your seniority, your chances of being called back, but there are no answers. Meanwhile, a coffee at Tim Hortons is now $3. A family meal costs far more than it did 6 months ago because supply chain inflation has touched everything. Rent hasn't dropped a cent. Bills keep stacking up. And that is the reality at the center of every industrial crisis. The lives of the people trying desperately to keep themselves afloat. This is precisely why Melanie Joly's actions matter so deeply. In essence, she wanted to send a message. Canada will not tolerate being taken for granted. General Motors accepted billions in public support. General Motors promised jobs, and then General Motors was the one who broke the promise. Therefore, the government would use every tool available to ensure General Motors understood that Canada does not negotiate from weakness. Canada negotiates on principle. Workers deserve protection. They have given their careers to this industry. They deserve a government that stands up when corporations turn their backs on them. What no one expected was what happened next. Within just 3 weeks of Canada reducing the tariff quotas, Detroit's entire mindset shifted.
Ford announced it was reconsidering its investment plans in Canada. Stellantis reshuffled its leadership, removing its Canadian chief executive officer, a clear signal that the company was reassessing its strategy.
General Motors quietly reached out to the Ontario government to explore the possibility of returning to Ingersoll. In an indirect way, they admitted it. Perhaps they were wrong. Supply chain experts across the industry also immediately began drafting new scenarios. If General Motors had to absorb a 25% tariff when importing vehicles into Canada, their costs would rise by 15 to 20%. If Stellantis lost half of its tax advantages, their profit margins would tighten, which led to the bigger question: is it more viable to maintain production in Canada than to live indefinitely under punitive tariffs? Suddenly, the company's calculations shifted entirely. The number of jobs that could be kept in Canada versus the jobs lost due to tariffs became a completely different equation. And interestingly, Unifor began receiving phone calls, not just from workers asking about their future, but from executives at General Motors and Stellantis asking what they must do to make things right. That is leverage. That is how a government uses its power. This moment matters far beyond a single plant because it reflects something deeper about Canada's economy and its national autonomy. For years, Canadian workers felt they had no choice but to accept whatever corporations demanded, because if they didn't, the companies would simply move production elsewhere. That was the power corporations held over governments and unions alike. Keep us happy or we go to Mexico. Pay lower wages or we leave. Offer subsidies or we shut down. And that strategy worked for a long time. But that was before Mark Carney, before this government began treating policy as a strategic tool rather than pleading with companies to stay. Carney chose a different approach. They build proactively strengthening Canadian housing, boosting defense investment by Canadian procurement policies, a major projects coordination office, all designed to reduce dependence on American goodwill and on the unpredictable decisions of United States corporations. The auto industry is gradually realizing that this government will support companies that commit to Canada, but if they break their promises, consequences will activate automatically. This isn't retaliation. It is structural principle. It isn't anti-business. It is pro-worker. And it protects sovereignty, something Canada has lacked for decades. And do you think global corporations aren't watching when Canada cut the quota for General Motors by 24%, when it threatened legal action against Stellantis, when it issued the 15-day ultimatum to General Motors? Every company with operations here began reassessing. Boeing, Intel, pharmaceutical giants, energy conglomerates, companies that once took Canadian subsidies for granted now understand Ottawa is serious. Keep your commitments, hire Canadians, invest in Canada, and the government will stand with you. Break those commitments, and the government has tools and will use them. That is not a warning. It is transparency, and it is working.
Businesses that once hesitated about Canada are now seeing a government that enforces its commitments, something rare in today's global landscape, where many governments hand out incentives without demanding accountability.
Canada is now positioning itself as a country where commitments matter in the global competition for manufacturing. The Ingersoll plant has therefore become symbolic, not just because of the 1200 jobs, but because of a much larger question. Are Canadian workers being put first? Is Canada's economic sovereignty real or merely procedural? Is the government willing to use its power in the interest of workers, or does it stand only with corporations? Joly set a firm 15-day deadline for General Motors to present a plan, not a vague proposal or a comforting promise, a real plan with timelines, investments, and deliverables. If General Motors is serious, the tariffs can be reversed and the reduced duties restored. But if they ignore it, believing they can withstand the political pressure, then the tariffs stay. That is leverage. That is what meaningful worker protection looks like. More importantly, it is already producing visible results. By November, just weeks after the tariffs tightened, General Motors immediately booked a meeting. Stellantis swiftly changed senior leadership. Suddenly, staying in Canada looked like the more rational option. When you cut off the ability to take subsidies and then walk away from a country, every corporate calculation flips. Donald Trump's economic strategy relied on pressure and chaos, scattershot tariffs, forcing companies to operate in uncertainty. Carney's strategy is the opposite, systematic and predictable. The message is simple. Honor your commitments and you benefit. Break them and you face consequences. Corporations hate uncertainty more than anything. Tariffs they can calculate. Chaos they cannot. When Jolie says these are the rules and then enforces them consistently, companies can plan around that. They may not like it, but they can adjust. That is good policy. It is sovereignty paired with stability. And we are witnessing a major turning point. But this was not an impulsive retaliation. It was a deliberate move that would change the game overnight. And we must ask ourselves what this means for the future. For years, Canadian workers were told they had to accept less because companies could leave at any time. Lower wages than Americans, fewer benefits, limited bargaining power. Now that picture is shifting. When the government uses policy tools to force companies to respect their commitments. When tariffs become real consequences rather than empty threats. When a minister sets a 15-day deadline and executives scramble to comply. It changes the balance of power. It shows workers they have more leverage than they realize. Their government has tools and is willing to use them on their behalf, not on behalf of corporations. And the message to companies is just as clear. Canada is no longer Detroit's backyard. Canada is an independent country with its own policies and the will to enforce them. In a mature democracy, that should be normal. But for Canada, after years of being overshadowed by American corporate interests, this is a profound shift.
And yet, while Detroit remained silent, Ottawa was quietly preparing a weapon that General Motors never saw coming. This weapon was not military, but economic, and its impact was devastating.
General Motors expected political outrage, maybe angry speeches, maybe a symbolic boycott. They did not expect a mathematical knockout. Canada didn't just slap the wrist of General Motors. It struck at the company's financial bloodstream. With one tariff adjustment, the cost of importing a vehicle jumped. No dealer can absorb that. No customer will pay that. And General Motors dealerships across multiple states suddenly had to rethink their entire inventory strategy. For the first time, Canada wasn't politely asking United States companies to respect their deals. It was enforcing them. American-made General Motors vehicles suddenly faced penalties. European imports, normal tariffs. Japanese competitors, normal tariffs. Only General Motors, the company that broke its promise, felt the full weight of the consequences. This wasn't a trade dispute. This was a government saying, you took our money, you broke your word, now pay the price.
And when General Motors executives saw the financial projections for the next quarter, panic set in instantly. But Jolie wasn't done. Her next move showed that this wasn't just about punishing General Motors.
This was about rewriting the rules of power in North America.
For decades, United States automakers operated with one assumption: Canada won't push back. They believed Canada had no leverage. But now General Motors saw that belief crumble in real time.
This brings us to the most critical realization. The auto remission framework was built months earlier, quietly, methodically, and with a clear purpose to hold corporations accountable without needing a political fight each time. That meant no shouting, no threats, no messy negotiations, no begging companies to stay, just rules, enforceable rules, the kind that companies can't talk their way out of. Break your commitment. Tariffs activate automatically. Respect your commitment. Benefits remain simple, predictable, brutal. The real shock wasn't the tariff. The real shock was the message. Canada finally knows its leverage, and that message traveled fast across boardrooms worldwide. But perhaps the biggest impact wasn't on General Motors or Stellantis. It was on the entire global auto industry watching this unfold. Within 3 weeks, the math forced Detroit to react. Ford paused all future planning. Supply chain directors started recalculating costs. Dealers prepared for potential shortages because they all realized a hard truth.
Canada's retaliation wasn't temporary, it was precedent.
And the world noticed. Serious companies, the ones that value stable and predictable rules, actually saw Canada becoming more attractive. Exploitative companies, the ones that rely on loopholes and threats, began to worry. In one stroke, Canada did something almost unheard of in North American economic history. It made companies understand that access to Canadian markets came with conditions, and those conditions were enforceable. General Motors' panic wasn't an accident. It was a lesson, a message, a warning shot. And that message set the stage for something even bigger, a new definition of sovereignty that Canada had never embraced so openly.
For generations, Canada was treated as a resource colony for the American auto industry, a place for cheap labor, cheap assembly, and polite compliance. But when General Motors collapsed its commitments, Canada didn't bow.
It didn't back down. It didn't freeze in fear. Instead, Canada used its own economic power, tariff frameworks, legal levers, and proved something people didn't expect. Canada doesn't need to beg multinational corporations anymore. It can hold them to their word.
For the workers in Ingersoll, this moment was bigger than one factory. It was the first sign of a government willing to use real power, not just speeches, to defend the people who built the country's manufacturing backbone.
For companies worldwide, the message was just as clear. Canada has rules now. You follow them or you face consequences. Automatic, structural, non-negotiable. The next 15 days will reveal the decision General Motors makes. Either they submit a real concrete plan with production numbers, timelines, and commitments, or the tariffs remain permanently. And if General Motors refuses, then Canada will make the penalties permanent, proving to every multinational corporation on the planet that commitments to Canadians are not optional anymore. This isn't just policy. This is sovereignty. This is power. This is what a country looks like when it finally decides that workers matter more than corporate excuses. If you understand the weight of what Melanie Joly has just done and understand that this is only the beginning, then stay tuned, because the next steps in Canada's economic strategy may be even more important than what we have just witnessed.